Hello, what's up everyone? Welcome to this new live stream where we are going to talk about Apple's new privacy requirements. So you might have heard that in spring of this year, so spring 2024, Apple is going to implement and enforce some new rules regarding how apps report their privacy nutrition labels. So you know this information on the App Store that lets user know which information is collected to track you, which information is collected by the app to identify you, I think. And there is a third one, information that could be used to track you, but is not used for this. Apple has already added this information that app developers had to report, and now they're going even one step further by having a look at how the SDKs, all of the third-party libraries that your app includes, also handle personal data in order to track, identify users. So we are going to have a look at this in order to demystify what's happening, understand what's changing, why is it changing, what you need to do in order to comply, and basically answer all of the questions that you might have if you have started to receive email from Apple in the last few days that were telling you you're missing a good reason for API, this kind of wording, or you're missing what's called a privacy manifest. We're going to have a look at all of this. Sorry, I've just eaten before, and I guess I can feel it. I see a few people in the chat, so welcome Martin, welcome Nicolas, and let's get started. So let me switch to the articles I have planned for us this evening. So you have all the links in the description. I'm going to cover all of these articles, and I'm going to comment on it and to try to make sense of it. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, remark, or anything while you are watching live, you have an amazing chat which is at your disposal and where you can just say whatever you want, and I will try to do my best to answer you. So the first article I found is something that Apple shared on their news and update section, so their press room basically. It's dated from December 7th, 2023, so end of last year. And I wanted to start by this one because it's the first announcement I could find following WWDC. So I figured it's a good starting point, and when I read it, I felt that it kind of mentioned like all of the big important information, so it's great to start. So, privacy updates for App Store submissions. Third-party SDK privacy manifest and signatures. Third-party software development kits, SDKs, can provide great functionality for apps. They can also have the potential to impact user privacy in ways that aren't obvious to developers and users. That's very true because even if they are open source, who here has included SDKs like Alamo Fire or Realm or Firebase, who has included them and can say that they have audited every single source code file inside these third-party libraries? I think no one did. And so when you're asked by the App Store currently to say what kind of private data your app handles, you're saying what your code does or what you think your code does, but the SDKs that you include are also part of your app, so they are also part of your code, technically, and it's very hard to report what they do accurately because most of the time, we just don't know for sure. We have some idea of what they do, we have what the developers have told us, but there is no way to be sure unless we audit everything, which, let's face it, no one will ever do. So as a reminder, when you use a third-party SDK with your app, you are responsible for all the code the SDK includes in your app and need to be aware of its data collection and use practices. This is a message that Apple has been pushing a lot for quite some years. I remember doing a developer lab on a completely different topic during the summer of 2019, so 5 years ago already. And I remember the DevRel at Apple pushing this message that you don't know what third-party SDK do, and they might be like a bigger threat to an app than whatever a malicious user could ever do. So it's a message they've been pushing for quite some time. And so this year at WWDC 23, they introduced a new privacy manifest and signatures for SDKs to help app developers better understand how third-party SDKs use data, secure software dependencies, and provide additional privacy protection for users. So there is the part about privacy, what the app does, but there is also enforcing signatures for SDKs, which is very important because some of you might remember, it's also from a few years ago, maybe 5, 6, maybe even 7 years, but Felix Krause, the original developer of Fastlane, at some point he was looking a lot into security, and he figured that back then with CocoaPods, there were a lot of very popular frameworks that used HTTP and not HTTPS. And so technically, it was possible to do man-in-the-middle attacks in order to swap the implementation of an SDK by another if someone is installing dependencies on the compromised network. And he was giving a good hypothesis, which is that if you do that on the public Wi-Fi of a conference or a hotel near a technical conference, there is actually a good chance that you might be able to inject something into a code base. So it's very niche and it's very hard to do in practice, but still the possibility was there. And of course, there was also the whole Xcode Ghost story when in China, because there wasn't a reliable way to download Xcode fast enough, people started putting mirrors, but these mirrors, they were actually giving you a malicious version of Xcode that would put malware into your app. So like things happen for real, things could happen, and we can see that Apple is taking it more and more seriously. So starting in spring 2024, so right now, if your new app or app update submission adds a third-party SDK that is commonly used in apps on the App Store, we'll see the list a bit later, you'll need to include the privacy manifest for the SDK. Signatures are also required when the SDK is used as a binary dependency. Because I guess with source code, Apple has a way to make sure that the manifest is truthful, but if it's a binary dependency, then people could try and play the game. It kind of reminds also of what Uber had done in the past, where inside their binary code, they had put code that basically, if the app was being reviewed by Apple, it would behave in a specific way, and in the wild, it would behave in a very different way. Kind of like what Volkswagen did with their engines, but on a software level. So this functionality is a step forward for all apps, and we encourage all SDKs to adopt it to better support the apps that depend on them. So we will check this list of commonly used third-party SDKs just a bit after. I want to talk also about this other part, which you might also have received emails about, which is new use cases for APIs that require reasons. So when you upload a new app or app update to App Store Connect that uses an API, including from third-party SDKs that requires a reason, you'll receive a notification if you haven't provided an approved reason in your app's privacy manifest. Based on the feedback we receive from developers, the list of approved reasons has been expanded to include additional use cases. If you have a use case that directly benefits users that isn't covered by an existing approved reasons, submit a request for new reason to be added. So we'll see just after what are these reasons and why they were included. I have found an article that you might have seen go by a few months ago. I think it was in January, and you will see why this is important. So starting in spring 2024, in order to upload your new app or app update to App Store Connect, you'll be required to include an approved reason in the app's privacy manifest, which accurately reflects how your app uses the API. So once again, all of this data that that you have to submit now. So the privacy manifest, the signatures, and the reasons for API, they are all consolidated into this new kind of file, which is called the privacy manifest. So let's talk a bit about these good reasons for API. So this is the second article I wanted to talk to you about. Maybe you've seen it being shared at the end of January, and it's about how ads and push notifications can be used to spy on iPhone users. So I won't go over the full article because it's a bit long, and I don't want to be just reading too much stuff because it's let's face it, it's a bit boring if I do it too much. But what they talk about is basically how it's possible to do fingerprinting in iOS currently. So fingerprinting, it's basically about being able to uniquely identify a device. It's something that Apple doesn't like because if you can fingerprint a device, then you can track a user across several apps without needing to share a common ID because you have this kind of fingerprint of the device. So how does fingerprinting a device looks like in practice? In practice, it's basically collecting a lot of signals about the device and trying to build a fingerprint that is as unique as possible. So back in the days, I think before iOS 7, it was something very easy, like trying to collect the MAC address of the modem or the Wi-Fi card on the iPhone. Then Apple made it impossible for because it was just too easy. But you can still do it. You can imagine calling a set of APIs. So, for instance, the API that tells you how much disk space is occupied, how much disk space is free, what's the current size of the screen, what's the percentage of the battery, what's the percentage not of the battery left, but the health of the battery. What's even the name of the device, even though I think it might, I'm not sure that iOS still gives you the name of the device these days, but yeah, the name of the device. For me, I'm French, it will say iPhone de Vincent, so it's not enough to identify me, but when you start crossing like the name of my device with how much disk space I have in total and how much disk space is free, all of these things, the health percentage of my battery, etc., you build a fingerprint that makes it possible to identify a user uniquely. Because when you get at that point across several dimensions, the more dimensions you have, the easier it becomes to identify someone precisely, even within a very large amount, very large group of people. And so some people figured out that if you combine these APIs that can provide a set of signals that are enough to build a fingerprint, and also something else that is about the push notifications. So let me show you where it is. Yes, it's here. So it's the fact that on iOS, you can trigger what's called a silent notification. So it's a notification which is sent to your to an iOS app. But contrary to your typical notification, it doesn't trigger anything that's user-facing. Instead, it's just going to run some code in the background. So it can be useful if a backend wants to let an app know, for instance, that something is happening and it should be running some code, or even what can be done is that when a notification is received to the device, it can be encrypted. So the app has the possibility of decrypting it, or the notification could also involve assets which are not included in the payload because the payload is very limited in size, and the app can download the asset before showing the user the notification. And what can be done is that the app can use this as an opportunity to run some code and then never show the actual notification. And this way, apps, or rather maybe SDKs within apps, can collect fingerprints about what is the state of a device. And this way you can imagine that, for instance, an application A in which you are logged collects signals like this, and this way it's able to collect a fingerprint and link it with your email, for instance, because you are logged into this app. And then when an application B wants to show you an ad, even though you are not connected with the same account, since application B can also, through the same SDK, collect the same set of fingerprints, then the backend of the ad SDK, which knows information being pulled both by app A and app B, is able to reconciliate the two of them, and in application B, show you relevant ads for your user profile, even though inside application B, you've never given any information that should allow such targeting. So I'm sorry if I wasn't super clear in trying to recap this from the top of my head, but that's the general idea. There are APIs that can enable fingerprinting when used in a way that collects a lot of signal that allow to uniquely identify a device, first problem, and then you can abuse notifications and how they work in order to collect this fingerprint regularly. And so my understanding when I saw the new announcements from Apple is that this is in a way an answer on this problem, because they want to make it even harder trying to collect a fingerprint of the device by forcing you to give a good reason to use APIs that can provide you the kind of signals that allow to uniquely identify a device. So I won't go into the details of the article, but if you want to read it, I would really encourage that you do, because it's a very interesting read and it shows you how API that you might have heard of in a WWDC session can actually be abused to do some really nasty stuff. And you're like, oh, I didn't thought that the API could be abused in that way. It's kind of interesting to read these kind of articles. So now let's move on to this third web page. So this web page is the web page that you are guaranteed to find as the first result if you search for the new requirements from Apple. So it's kind of similar to the one I showed you first, but it's a bit more recent, I think, and it's basically what you will find if you search. So let's also cover it together. So it's about the upcoming third-party SDK requirements. So SDKs can provide great functionality for apps. We've just seen that before, but they also have the potential to impact user privacy in ways that aren't obvious to developers and users, especially when it's ads SDK where you don't really know what they are doing. As a reminder, when you use a third-party SDK with your app, you are responsible for all the code your SDK includes in your app, and you need to be aware of its data collection and use practices. At WWDC, so they introduced new privacy manifests and signatures to help you bring more awareness for how third-party SDKs use data. This functionality is a step forward for all apps, and we encourage all SDK to adopt it to better support the apps that depend on them. So it was the same text than in the last article, I think. So how is it done? Two things. So privacy manifest. Privacy manifest files outline the privacy practices of the third-party code in an app in a single standard format. So it's about consolidating data about every third-party SDK included into a single source of truth. When you prepare to distribute your app, Xcode will combine the privacy manifests across all the third-party SDKs used by your app into a single, easy-to-use report, with one comprehensive report that summarizes all the third-party SDKs found in an app. It will be even easier for you to create more accurate privacy nutrition labels. So it's about enabling developers to really give precise information to the user by forcing the SDKs to make how they use private data obvious to the developers. Then we have signature for SDKs. So now with signatures for SDKs, when you adopt a new version of a third-party SDK in your app, Xcode will validate that it was signed by the same developer, improving the integrity of your software supply chain. So making sure that no one swapped your SDK by a malicious version of it. And finally, here we have the list of SDKs that require a privacy manifest and signature. So the following are commonly used SDKs in apps on the App Store. Starting in spring 2024, you must include the privacy manifest for any SDK listed below when you submit new apps in App Store Connect that include those SDKs, or when you submit an app update that adds one of the listed SDKs as part of the update. Signatures are also required in these cases where the listed SDKs are used as binary dependencies. Any version of a listed SDK, as well as any SDKs that repackage those on the list, are included in the requirement. Something interesting is that they say when you submit an app update that adds, they say when you submit a new app or when you submit an app update that adds one of the listed SDKs as part of the update. So I think if your app already has one of these SDKs in the app for now, and you don't update the SDK, I'm not sure that Apple will reject your app. It's like, because imagine you have a very old version of Alamo Fire or AF networking, for instance, and updating to the latest version, which has a manifest, would be very costly. It seems, from what I read, that Apple won't force you to update all of your SDKs to the newest version that contains the privacy manifest. But I might be wrong on this one, but the way it's phrased is how I understand it, at least. And we can see, so we have this list of SDKs. So we can see some familiar names like AF Networking, so the very popular networking library from Objective-C, Alamo Fire, which is its Swift counterpart. We can see Capacitor, which is a framework to do, it's kind of like Cordoba, which is also here, so a framework to do a multi-device based on using WK WebView. We have SSL libraries. We have libraries from Facebook. What do we have else? Oh, nice to see. Hello, Daniel. Nice to see a first comment from Twitter X in the chat. So it's good to see that I can see these comments in the chat and it works correctly. We can see Flutter, of course, because Flutter imports so many APIs from iOS, since you can build an entire app with Flutter. We can see all of the Firebase SDKs. What else can we see? The Google SDKs. We can see Lottie. Interestingly, it will be, we will have a look after if Lottie has already added a privacy manifest. I would be curious what kind of information Lottie is collecting on the user. I know there is Alamo Fire, so we'll check Alamo Fire also. MB Progress HUD. I think I might have used this one in the past. I think it was to show like it's when you wanted to block the UI by showing a model that would show like a spinner. So it's a little bit like out of fashion, but it used to be very popular in the past, especially for apps where it made sense to block the UI while something was happening. And banking apps were a typical example of that. And I was working on banking apps before, so like this rings the best. We'll also check this one. We have Promises, but we don't have Promise Kit. We have Realm. We have Eric Swift. We'll check Eric Swift also. SnapKit, which is a way to do programmatic UI. So interesting to see that it's here. Swifty JSON. I'm thinking they might have just taken a list of the most popular frameworks and just put them there, regardless of what their actual business actually is, because I don't imagine like this kind of Progress HUD library collecting a lot of private data. Or maybe they've been lying to us since the beginning. We'll see. We'll see. I don't think that they do, to be honest. Not required for, yeah, so that's kind of the way I understand it. I'm not 100% sure, but you see the way it's written, they do say that. So when you submit new apps in App Store Connect that include those SDKs, or when you submit an app update that adds one of the listed SDKs as part of the update. So if you submit an app update that doesn't add one of the SDK, meaning that it was already there, it doesn't seem to break the rule. But I would make sure before betting your entire strategy on it. But it feels like that. And to be honest, I did receive emails about the API good reasons, which we're going to cover just after. But I didn't receive any emails about the SDKs, so I guess that might be true. One message in the chat from Daniel. Sorry, probably said this already, but what is the URL for the site you're looking at now? So I'm sorry because you are watching from Twitter. I've put the links in the description, but in YouTube. So because it's harder to put you have less room to put links when doing a live on Twitter. So you can find the links right now. You can just go to my YouTube channel. So it's just my name, and then you will find the live and you will find the links in the description. Sorry that I couldn't include them in YouTube. That's interesting because the last paragraph might contradict. I watched a video from WWDC a few days ago. Unfortunately, we can't watch it live because last time I tried that, I got a strike on my YouTube channel. I'm not trying it again. Oh, what's interesting is that here you mentioned binaries. Oh yes, but binaries for like, I think what this might mean is that it's when you give your SDK as a binary. Or rather, okay, no, I think I understand it better. So when they say SDK developers need to sign and provide manifest for their binaries, yes, that makes sense. However, if Apple gives a refusal, it won't be on the SDK because Apple doesn't have the power to refuse a new version of an SDK because that doesn't go through the App Store. Apple will give a refusal to the app developer. So this sentence that SDK developers need to sign and provide manifest to their binaries, I understand that it's important that they do it because indeed, if they don't, then users who are starting to use the SDK won't be able to successfully have an app approved by Apple, which is a problem. So that makes sense as a requirement for SDK developers, but I don't think that it contradicts the wording. So here, that seems to suggest that until, if you're already using the third-party dependency, until you update it, you don't need to provide a privacy manifest. Which, to be honest, when you think about it, kind of makes sense because otherwise there are so many apps that have like old version of SDK that would be very costly to update. I guess that like the cost and the risk of seeing like apps just be kicked out of the App Store, I'm not sure that Apple has a lot to gain by doing that versus what they would lose. So I'm sure that it will come like in the future, but for now. It kind of makes sense for me that they wouldn't enforce it like that strongly to begin with. Oh, you're saying there is a problem on LinkedIn. Oh, that sucks. So I will check the replay afterward to see if there's something I can improve. Sometimes it can happen that like with some providers there are issues. I don't see any errors on my streaming software, but sorry to hear that. But thank you for making the switch to keep watching. This is very much appreciated. So let's have a look now in the documentation. What do we have in this privacy manifest file? So this is the link that you will find if you follow one. This is the page that you will find if you follow like, I think it's this link. Yeah, I followed this link. Let me just go back so you have everything open, but it was this link right here, privacy manifest. So what do? They allow us to declare the data collected by your app or by third-party SDKs. So what they do is that they are basically some kind of like property list, from what I understand, where you both say what data is collected and for what purpose, and also which API, which critical API is used and for which reason. So you have the type of data that you collect, the data that is linked to the user, that is tracking the user, and the purpose for which you access the data. What do they say? You need to use some predefined values. And so for the collected data types, so you can say that you collect name, email address, phone number, physical address, or other user contact information. For health and fitness domain, so health data and medical data. Fitness data, so anything that is used to track, like I guess it would be, for instance, like how much people have been running or just like how often they exercise. That's already some kind of private data. Financial, so it's payment info, credit card info, including credit score. So this is more of a US thing, but very important for US users. Other financial info, such as salary, income, assets, debt, or any other financial information. So if you're writing, for instance, a stock price tracker and people can set their own stock, this falls into this category, I guess. So location, of course, precise location or coarse location, so location with a lower precision. Sensitive information, so I guess it's information which is often protected by law. So biometric data, trade union membership, political opinion, religious beliefs, disability, this kind of data which is protected by laws, even like very strong laws depending on the country in which you are. I'm in France and there are some very strong laws about some very specific data points. So the contacts of the user, the social graph, user content. So text messages, photos or videos, audio data, gameplay content, even saved games. So if you're doing gaming, anything that can be used to identify a user in a way. So customer support, other user content, browsing history, of course, search history, of course, user IDs and device IDs, purchase history, and then product interaction, so number of app launch, of taps, clicks, scrolling information, stuff that can also allow you to build a user profile, music listening data, so very like anything that can anything basically that was generated from the user in a way. Advertising data, of course, diagnostic data. So if you use things like Crashlytics, this falls into this category. Surroundings. So this is more for augmented reality apps, I would say. Things about the body, so the hand and the head movement. Maybe more for apps also that use the Vision Pro. And other data types. Then you have the reasons why the app or the third-party SDK collects the data. So third-party advertising, at least you have to say it. Developer advertising or marketing. So first-party marketing. So for instance, you want to collect data about how people use your app so that you can then market the features of your app to your users. So for instance, you're an app that has a paid version and you want to market the paid subscription to your user, you fall into that category. I see a very good remark. Curious, they did not put IP address in this list. That's true. They also didn't put like the MAC address. I think, that's my own theory, but I think it's because I'm not sure actually that iOS apps can access the IP address since like iOS 7, because it used to be the case, but they cannot access the MAC address also now unless you're on a jailbroken device. So I think that's why. I think it's because it's not possible, or it's just like straight just like not allowed by the App Store terms and condition. I think that might be why, but you make a very good point. Thank you for mentioning it. So analytics data that you also need to declare. Product personalization. So if you tailor the content of the app to your user. Something that we might see more and more with generative AI that allows you to easily generate content that matches specific users. App functionality, so authenticating users, security measures, which could be legitimate. For instance, I used to work on the kind of apps that do like ticketing. So people who buy like subway tickets in an app. There are legitimate reasons that you want to make sure that the subway pass that was bought for a device cannot be loaded into another device, and basically someone cannot buy one subway pass and then sell it on the dark web to many people that can then use it. And since it's everything like is offline for like faster response time, then people can pay for some kind of pirated subway access. So there are reasons when it can be like legitimate, but even if it's the case, you still need to declare it. And other purposes. And so, how do you create the app privacy report? So the privacy report is different from the privacy manifest. The privacy report is a document which is created by aggregating the privacy manifest of your app and the third-party SDKs that your app include. And you use the privacy report to better understand the data collected by your app and what is done with this data, and you use this information in order to set the privacy nutrition labels on the App Store. And so you do it in Xcode. So I won't show it to you because you need to do, I think you need to archive with a real app, and I don't have a paid developer account actually. So I won't show you this part, but you can do it. You need to just do product archive, and then you right click the archive and you do generate privacy report. And it's going to generate it to you, and you can have a look. They show you an example in the WWDC session, and it's just like it's a PDF. It's all of the privacy manifest playlist combined into a PDF, and that's it. So we've seen what a privacy manifest is. We'll see one for real just after. But before, we need to see one last thing. So we saw how a privacy manifest describes how data is collected. There is also the part about the required reason API, which as a developer is very interesting to figure out, but I would say maybe even more urgent because I did receive email about not providing reasons for APIs. So this one, you might need to fix it even faster. So what's the overview? Some API that your app uses to deliver its core functionality in code you write or included in third-party SDKs have the potential of being misused to access device signals to try to identify the device or user, also known as fingerprinting. So what I was mentioning when I was referring to the article from 9to5Mac. Regardless of whether a user gives your app permission to track, fingerprinting is not allowed. Describe the reasons your app or third-party SDK on iOS, iPadOS, tvOS, visionOS, or watchOS, that's a lot of OSs, uses these APIs, and check that your app or third-party SDK only uses the APIs for the expected reasons. So Apple is cracking down on API usage for APIs that could be used to gather signals to ultimately do fingerprinting. So important, if you upload an app to App Store Connect that uses required reason API without describing the reason in its privacy manifest file, Apple sends you an email reminding you to add the reason to the app's privacy manifest. That's the kind of emails I've been getting. Starting May the 1st, 2024, so a little bit less than 1.5 months from now, apps that don't describe their use of required reason API in their privacy manifest file aren't accepted by App Store Connect. So you want to have a look at this. Quite soon. And Apple is reminding you with an email for every build. So if you send daily build, you're getting daily emails. So at least you don't run a chance of forgetting about it. And so for each category of required reason API that your app or third-party SDK uses, you need to add a dictionary to NS Privacy Accessed API Types array in your app or first-party privacy manifest file that reports the reason your app uses the API category. If you use the API in your app's code, then you need to report the API in your app's privacy manifest. If you use it in a third party, then it's the third party's privacy manifest. We get that. Your third-party SDK can't rely on the privacy manifest files for apps that link the third-party SDK or those of other third-party SDKs the app links to report your third-party SDK's use of required reason API. So what they say is that if an SDK uses an API with a required reason, the SDK needs to declare it itself. You cannot tell as an SDK developer, oh, app user, by the way, as part of the integration guide, you need to add this to your privacy manifest. The SDK needs to say it itself. That's how I understand it. Trying to just reread it to make sure I got it correctly. Yeah, I think that's the correct way to get it. So try to make sure that SDK developers cannot just get rid of their responsibility onto the app developer. For each executable or dynamic library in an app that uses a required reason API, the bundle that includes the executable or dynamic library needs to include a privacy manifest file that reports the API. For the expected location of frameworks and dynamic libraries, see placing content in a bundle. So what's interesting is that if you statically include a third-party dependency, maybe then in that case, you need to do it inside your own apps, I guess, because when you include statically, it's part of your the code of the dependency is part of your app's executable. It's not a third-party executable that's loaded by the loader at runtime. So it's something to have in mind if you are in that case. Another important block, so your app or third-party SDK must declare one or more approved reasons that accurately reflect your use of each of these APIs and the data derived from their use. You may use these APIs and the data derived from their use for the declared reason only. These declared reasons must be consistent with your app's functionality as presented to users, and you may not use the APIs or derived data for tracking. So they're trying to tell you, basically, don't fuck with us. That's what they're trying to tell you. you've been warned. That's what this says. So each dictionary in the NS privacy accessed API types needs to contain these keys and values. So there is the API type and the API reason. Okay. So let's have a look at a few APIs that needs to be declare a reason. So everything around file stamp. File timestamp, sorry, not file stamp, file timestamp. The following APIs for accessing file timestamps require reasons for use. So file timestamps is knowing when a file was created, because it's a great way indeed to gather signal. So getting the creation date, the modification date, the creation date key also, which I guess is a way to retrieve the data through a dictionary. What's interesting is that you see both like methods that seems to be from Swift or Objective-C, and then older methods that might be even part of C, of the C of the POSIX API, things like fstat, lstat, this kind of APIs. And so the reasons that they can do. So what do we have? So to display the file stamp to the user, if you're just building some kind of file system browsing UI. So to access, so this one is called declare to access the timestamp. Yeah, they say to access. It doesn't say what you do with it, but it's okay to access it. Okay. So this one is to access. The fact that it's not like obvious when I read it shows you that you need to spend some time to have a look at it. But basically there is displaying the timestamps, and this one is accessing the timestamp, but it doesn't say what you do with it. So that's why I'm a bit confused here. I'm a bit confused by these two. And this one is interesting because this one, it's if the SDK is actually implementing this API, but as a wrapper that the app can then call. So the SDK is not calling it itself, but it's providing a mechanism for the app to call it. So that's interesting. It might be also why they were saying that they added some additional reasons following feedback from developers, because I can imagine that this would not have been obvious to figure out on the first iteration. Then we have APIs around system boot time. So how long has the system been running? Once again, something that can be used in order to build a fingerprinting of a user. So you can do it if you want to measure the time between events to perform calculation, but they may not be sent off device, so it needs to stay on device. So that's a pretty strong requirement. But this can be legitimate. Like if you really want to have a precise measure of time, getting the system uptime and the difference, I think this might be more precise, especially this API here, than calling NSDate. I think it's more precise if you need things up to the second, or even like lower than a second. The other one is so it's to calculate timestamps for events related to UIKit or AVF audio framework. In this case, they may be sent off device. So the timestamps may be sent off device, but the system boot time cannot, which kind of makes sense because the timestamp is part of a file. It may make sense to send it off device. Or like if you are reading a file and you want to send information, for instance, about when users have been, like when you are on YouTube, it shows you like the part of the video that were watched the most. So you can see like sometimes you can see like a spike, and it's what people have rewatched the most. I guess in order to do that, you need to send some timestamp information to say, okay, it's at this moment that people are rewinding in the video. I'm not saying it's implemented that way, but it's a possibility. And the other one is a bug report that the user could opt into. Then you've got things about like disk space, which also is a great way to get some data about a device. Active keyboard APIs, yeah, because if you have like some weird keyboard enabled, that gives you like a strong signal. Also, you can use it like for marketing purposes, because if a user has like two keyboards, maybe English and Spanish, for instance, you might be able to infer that there is a high probability that there is some kind of like Latino ethnicity, and so maybe that can be used by ads tracking network to push some specific ads. That makes a lot of sense. This one, you will want to have a look at it, because it's almost guaranteed that every app uses it, and every app is going to have to justify why they use it. It's the user defaults. So you see, you can use it to give information that is only accessible to the app itself. The app itself and app extensions and app clips. And this one, if there are, so if you're just a wrapper around a user default, like for instance, Flutter probably does. And yeah, you see, they say that it cannot be accessed by other apps. That's interesting, because it can be common for apps to try and synchronize some properties across like several like devices, and so that user defaults, when you change something, you have code that also sends it to a backend. So that then you might run into trouble here actually. So if you're using user default, which I guess you are, you will probably want to read all of this and pay a lot of attention to it. So we've covered a few examples. Now let's see actual privacy manifest files. So I'm on Alamofire on GitHub. You know what? I'm gonna download the code, because I could show it to you. The file, it's here, it's in sources, you can see it's here, but it's a plist. So I think it would be better if we see it in Xcode with a nice user interface around it. So I'm trying to open the project I've downloaded in Xcode. Of course, I hadn't opened Xcode before the live stream, so I'm gonna trust Alamofire. All right, the window is at the right size, perfect. And so it should be in sources, we were saying. That's interesting, because I don't see it. So it was in GitHub sources, and there was, maybe the file hasn't been added to the project in Xcode, but let's see. If I do show in Finder, so yeah, we can see that. You can see the file is here, but for some reason it doesn't appear here. You know what? I'm just gonna try to add it. No, actually, I cannot add it. So I guess, or maybe actually it's being shown somewhere. Trying to see if maybe it's part of the project no, it's not part of the info here. I see a message in the chat. I'm going to have a look at it. So there is another section that is important in the privacy manifest that I saw was overlooked in the documentation. It's about tracking domains. Yes, great point. Yes, I forgot to mention it. You also need in the privacy manifest to declare the domains that you use to track your user. And what's great is that they explain to you in the WWDC session is that if you declare the domains truthfully, which you are supposed to do, then if by mistake you make a call to that domain before the user has accepted the app tracking transparency pop-up, then iOS will block that call. So that's actually quite a nice feature, because I guess the privacy laws make it illegal to do the tracking call before the user has accepted to be tracked, and so this tracking domain feature can make basically makes iOS help you enforce that you are compliant. So that seems like something that you do want to leverage, and it's a great feature. And indeed, they don't mention it anywhere in the document we've just read. So I guess it's not becoming mandatory, but I would say it's a great feature to use because unless you're doing shady stuff that you shouldn't be doing, it's a good way to have iOS make sure that you are compliant because URL session will not make any call to your tracking domain or tracking domains if the user hasn't accepted to be tracked. So that's great. Like you're offloading an important check to iOS, so there is no reason like why you wouldn't do it. So thanks a lot, Octavian, for reminding us and reminding me of this. So let's see if I. Oh, this is interesting. So just making sure that you can see it. So I'm searching for privacy, and you can see there is the privacy info here. So interesting that it's showing in supporting files, and when I do, so yes, so it's interesting when I do show in Finder, it does show the privacy report. So it's the file I was trying to find inside sources, but you can see that actually it was moved into this supporting file. So I guess it's just because they must have created like a group without a folder. I think that might be why, because you can see here the icon is slightly different. So I guess it's a group without a folder, and so that's why it was there and not at the root level. Okay. Yeah. Honestly, you're right. App tracking transparency has gotten like quite useful. And you know what? I'm doing a screenshot of your message in the chat because I want to keep this idea in mind because that might be a topic for a future live stream. Talking about app tracking transparency and all the things it can do to help you. So thank you for the suggestions because I think it's a great idea. And so this is the privacy info. So it's the same thing than this. It's just like a playlist shown in the UI, but if you do like open as source code, you see, you can also see it like that if you want. But I want to see it as a playlist. So tracking enabled, no. So Alarm Fire isn't tracking anyone. There are no tracking domain, no nutrition label, and there is only one API, and it's system boot time. And it's done for the reason measure time on device. So let's try and find which API is called. I guess maybe this is, I'm gonna try and make a guess as to why this could be used. This might be to generate like, you know, when you make a multi-part HTTP call, you need to declare a boundary that separates like the different elements of your request in the payload. Maybe it's to generate dynamic values for this. That's my guess, which is probably false, but I just want to try and guess why they would be using these APIs. So let's see. So it's 35F9.1. It's super precise taxonomy. I have no idea where this number come from, but let's see. Okay, so it's here. So you want to access system boot time in order to measure the amount of time that has elapsed between events that occurred within the app or to perform calculation to enable timers. And so let's see if there is a call to system uptime somewhere inside this project. Yes. So you can see. So it's a response serializer. So it gets the start time. And when is it used, this start time? I'm trying to find all of the occurrences of this start time. No, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to see where this variable is being used. Okay, so it's to measure how long it took to serialize the thing. So I think it's more of a way to. I would like to know who is using actually this data, how it's being used. But I guess it might be, for instance, when you enable verbose mode in the logs, so it can tell you like exactly how long it took to serialize data, because it kind of makes sense, because if you need to serialize like a large object, it might be a performance problem, and so you want to know how long it took so that you can know, okay, the network call was long, why was it, what was taking a lot of time. So we have it, yeah, here to same thing for the end, same thing here for the start and the end, okay. Same thing. So here it's to measure latency with a WebSocket, which I guess is also a legitimate use case. You want to make sure there isn't too much latency when you've opened the WebSocket. And this one, it's for an authentication interceptor, and so it's to compute a refresh window. So I guess it's to know when a token is likely to have expired. And indeed, using the system uptime is a better way, because if you use NSDate, the user might, for instance, change their time zones. And it could be just, imagine like a user that lives at the border between two countries who use different time zones. Typically someone that lives at the border between Spain and Portugal, for example, in Europe. There is a 1 hour time zone. If you use the date rather than the system uptime for this kind of operation, then whenever the user goes from Portugal to Spain, maybe it would assume that the token has expired, even though it hasn't, because 1 hour hasn't elapsed. It's just that the user switched time zone, and the new time zone is 1 hour 1 hour later than the previous one. So that's a very good use case of using system uptime, actually. I'm not gonna lie, I've worked on apps that were doing this kind of token verification, and I'm not sure they use system uptime. I think we might have been using either a timer, which I think timer, I would expect the timer to not break when you change time zone, but if you use a date, it might not work. Even though it was more of an edge case for us, so it wasn't super important, but that shows that even things that seem simple, there is always a lot of edge cases, and everything that's around like time is always guaranteed to be tricky one way or another. And let's see if they use this other API. So Mac Absolute Time, no, they don't use it. So at least Alamo Fire seems to provide a valid XC manifest, and you can see that they still had one API that they had to declare, and you can also see that without this file making information available as a developer, what were the chances that as a developer you would have been aware that Alamo Fire was doing this and you would have reported it correctly? I think it was pretty close to 0, let's be honest. So let's see, I want to see other SDKs I wanted to check. Yes, I was curious to check Lottie. What does Lottie do? So I just want to check Lottie iOS. So I'm gonna have a look. This time I won't download it, I will just have a look at the file. So they also added one. Let me hide this. So you can see they don't track, no tracking domain, makes sense. No collected data type, and for the API that they use, it's the timestamp, and it kind of makes sense that they use the timestamp, because since they are dealing with animation files, it makes total sense that they would declare this. So once again, something that is not obvious to figure out when you just use the framework. And let's see what this reason corresponds to. So you access timestamp, size, or other metadata of files or directories that the user specifically granted access to, such as using a document picker view controller. What might also happen is that maybe it's not Lottie itself that uses it, but maybe it's more like, now I was about to say maybe if there is a demo app, no, because it's an, no, the example app is another directory, because I was like, maybe there is a demo app that has a document picker, but maybe it's just like to get, maybe I guess Lottie wants to get the size of the file, for instance, just so that it can like pre-allocate resources, this kind of thing. And so it's a very legitimate need. So I understand why they ask for this data. Let's see another one I wanted to check. Oh yes, I wanted to check MB Progress HUD, because this one, I mean, if it tracks you, like I would be so surprised, but I don't think it does. So let's see. Is it the one that I remembered? Yes, it's the one that shows like the blocking loader that I do remember. And so let's see. Where is the privacy stuff? So no, it's not here. There is but it's the workspace, so it's not that. Is there an issue to add one? Oh yes, there is an issue for that. Is there a plan to add? So it seems that they haven't. So yeah, last update 5 years ago. So I guess it's one of the cases I was mentioning before. Yeah, indeed, last update 4 years ago. So yeah, I didn't catch this, but indeed, it's quite old. Very good catch. Very good catch. Let me show your comment on the live stream. Very good catch. So yeah, I guess it's one of the reasons why I think that if you're already using the SDK, Apple won't force you, because it's in that use case. What are your options? I mean, I guess if they were to force you, you would need to fork it and then add the privacy manifest yourself, but you don't know the source code, so you will need to audit it, which is a lot of time. So I guess someone would fork it and do it in the community, because it would make sense to just share it with everyone else, or to pool efforts together. But this means that in the current state, any new app cannot start using MB Progress HUD HUD. I don't think it's a good idea to use it for a new app, but they couldn't. And any app that would like to add this framework as a dependency also can't do it, because there is no privacy manifest. So I think it's a good example to check it, because it kind of shows you the kind of issues that you could run into, even though, to be fair, it's an old framework and I wouldn't recommend using it these days. I think the pattern of blocking the UI is quite old-fashioned, and this only works with UIKit also and with SwiftUI, so it's quite an old framework, but I'm glad we've checked it, because it shows that yeah, as you're saying, Octavian, good with an example of framework that may fuck with you. Yes, indeed. Even though I don't think, from the wording of it, I don't think it should, and it kind of makes sense, because think about just how many apps must be using like this framework and that are still on the App Store, and they are being maintained, but like once a year for the critical issues, and then being generous. I don't think that Apple would want to kick all of these apps from the App Store, because they still provide valuable services. So that would be like a bit like the nuclear option when there is no reason for it. So when you see this example, it kind of makes sense, the way that I understand the rules that they are giving you. Is it ethical for us to sign a fork using our entity instead of theirs? I guess if you've made your fork, then you can. Then it's up to you to sign it, because it's your fork. So it's more a question of like, does the license allows you to make a fork and include it? I guess it might be the case, but I guess it's more of a license question in a way. But yeah, from the moment that you've done a fork, anyway, the developer won't be signing your fork, because it's not their project anymore. And you would also need to change the bundle ID. I would imagine. Yeah, I guess you would need to change the bundle ID. So it becomes your fork, and you become responsible for embedding this code inside your iOS app. But remember, signatures are only for binary frameworks. So it's not. I mean, usually you don't include binary frameworks. Usually you include like source code that gets built. In my experience, the frameworks that were provided as binary, it was mostly like security frameworks, where people don't want to share the source code, or it's more like ads. Basically, when someone gives you a binary framework, to be honest, it's because they don't want you to see the source code. So there could be several reasons for it. There might be because showing the source code is besides the point, typically security SDKs, because they don't want to show all of the measures they implement. That could be because the SDK is providing a feature they make you pay for, and they don't want you to be able to copy it. So they don't want to share their technology. Also makes sense. And the last example is when an SDK is doing something shady and they don't want to be found out. Think typically all of the ads SDK that are being used, since they are being used in many apps, if they are open source and do things which are shady, it's guaranteed that at some point some developer will find out and will spill the bean publicly on the internet. So for them, it could make sense to offer to distribute a binary framework, but most of the time frameworks that are used as open source as source code, and these ones, they don't need to be signed. Yeah, exactly. It seems that you don't need to panic upgrade all of the SDKs, because when I heard about this, I was like, whoa, you need to upgrade all of the SDKs. Even if you have an app which is being maintained and everything, it's still quite a task, because you need to update the SDKs, and maybe they will introduce breaking changes that you need to address. Maybe there will be slight changes in behavior that might break your app. So updating all of the SDKs is definitely not a tricky. It's definitely not an easy thing to do, because there might be side effects and unintended side effects. So I was like, whoa, this seems to be a big impact, and actually it seems to be more measured. And as I was saying, I only saw emails for not providing a good reason for APIs. That's the only emails I saw. I don't remember seeing seeing an email for missing a privacy manifest about data being collected. And yeah, using old versions of Alamo Fire, which makes sense, because if you've included Alamo Fire and the features match your need, you won't be looking at updating it, because there is just no reason to add more work and more uncertainty for you. To be honest, the only times when I was working in my previous job, when I updated Alamo Fire or even IF networking on an older app, was when there was a security audit and they were saying, okay, this version is considered to be at risk and you need to update. But otherwise, if it works, you don't want to break it, and so you don't have a strong incentive to update SDKs. That's the hard truth to it. Let's check a few more, because I think there is one I wanted to check. Which one was it? Yes, Eric Swift, of course. I've used Eric Swift for maybe not 6 years, but 4 years in my previous job. So I'm curious to see what they had to declare. So I'm going to look. What's the name of the file again? It's the it's this. It's XC privacy. So I'm gonna search for this. Or if I search for XC, it seems I don't see one. Trying to see what's happening here. I don't see one. Let me check the issues. If I search for privacy, so yes, there is something opened on December 11th. And let's see what we have at the end from 2 days ago. So what people say? Yes. This mentions something that indeed, when you get your email from Apple for the reasons to use an API, I think Apple tells you that your app uses the API, but it doesn't say if it's your app directly or a third-party library. So actually, you might have to do like a whole like process of elimination to try and figure out which dependency is blocking the submission of your app. So that kind of makes sense. And let's see like this answer. So they say they didn't get any timestamp warnings. They got other warnings, but inside their own code base, not Eric Swift. So they seems to say that Eric Swift doesn't use anything that requires a privacy manifest, which kind of makes sense because in a way Eric Swift is doing its own thing, and then code that would use such APIs, it will be like in the observation code, which is part of your app. But it's interesting to see that because it could have been the case. For instance, think about there is a way that I mean, how do I phrase it? Like Eric Swift allows you to process events over time, just like Combine. And so since time is involved, maybe Eric Swift could have been, for instance, calling the API to get the system time, just to be able to more precisely measure what's happening in order to show like verbose logs. So it's interesting to see that it's the case that they don't. And it's also interesting to see that these changes in how you use APIs might make it so that popular open source SDKs, maybe they will be more cautious, or they will not be calling APIs, these kind of APIs, as much as they would have in the past, because calling them now, it creates kind of like a small burden on the developers who use the framework. So if there is not a strong reason to do it, maybe people who design these libraries will be like, do we want to put that burden on the on the app developer, and so make it a tiny bit harder to integrate our library, or do we just want to not use this API and maybe use another which is maybe slightly less precise, but that takes less effort on the privacy side? And also, this shows that it's pretty sure that Apple, the way they did it is that they got some like where was it? It was here. They got some like statistics on which libraries were the most used, and they were like, okay, we're going to put like the top, maybe like top 50 or something like that, because Eric Swift doesn't use anything, so it didn't make sense that it would need to have a privacy manifest. So we're going to check also Snapkit and also SD Web Image, because SD Web Image, since it's a networking framework, it might make more sense that it does that it handles private information. So Snapkit, I'm not sure if it's linked to Snapchat. I don't think so. And it's basically a framework that allows you to create constraints in this kind of like programmatic syntax. So I think it was very popular before like there was the, now in UIKit you have the anchor API, so you can say create a constraint by saying parent view dot trailing anchor equal to other view dot leading anchor, but this was added not straight from the beginning, and so at some point it was like harder to use this API because you would need to you still had to support versions of iOS that didn't have access to the Anchor API, and so Snapkit was a nice alternative at this point. There is an interesting message. Let me read it. So Octavian is saying, just to mention here, for anyone integrating binaries instead of source code, you can find the XC manifest file inside the XC framework if the developer included it. Oh, that's a good advice. Thanks for sharing it. And thank you, Jonas. I'm glad to see that you've enjoyed this live stream. It's the first time I'm doing this kind of like live stream that is linked to what's new in the iOS ecosystem. So I'm glad to see that you've enjoyed it. And I try to, if it's successful, I plan to do like other live stream like that when there is something new that is worth like discussing. Because I guess it makes sense for me. Like I always learn new stuff just talking about it with you in the chat, and being able to take like 1 hour and a half to discuss it is super useful. And I'm sure that this information will be valuable to several people, because when I was reminded about this constraint last week, I was like, oh yes, there's this thing happening, and I'm not sure about it. And if me who follows like what's happening because I have to create content and so I need to be aware of what's happening, I was surprised a bit, then I can imagine that it's even more the case for someone that doesn't do this kind of like isn't on the lookout for what's happening as much as I am. But back into the topic. So I wanted to see if there is, so in the sources, if there is this privacy manifest. Yes, it's there. So SnapKit, what does it do? So no tracking, no accessed API type, no collected data, no tracking domain, so nothing. Which makes sense because it's just calling APIs to build layout constraints. So it makes total sense. But it's interesting that now they have to state explicitly that they are not doing anything fishy under the hood, which we were pretty sure of it because it's open source. So if they were doing something weird, someone would have found it by now. But it's interesting to see that now they have to say it, and it definitely shows that Apple, they made that list by picking the biggest SDKs and being like, okay, let's focus on them to begin with. But they didn't look, I think, or not as, or like the main criterion wasn't are these SDK doing something fishy, like seeing an SDK being included in this list is not a presumption of guilt, not at all. It's just that they are the most popular ones. And let's see what SD web image has to say. So SD web image sources. Where is? So there is no sources. Oh, because there are several ones. I'm looking to see. I can just look actually for like it's manifest, I think. Or is it privacy? Yes, it's XC privacy. Okay, so SD web image. Okay, so actually it's the one in web image. So it's just like a symbolic link. So it's this one that I want, I think. Yes. Okay, so there is more stuff. So they don't track, they don't collect data, they don't have a tracking domain, but they access APIs. So they access the timestamp API, interestingly, for a different reason. So let's look it up. Okay. So it just says they access the timestamp inside the app container, app group container, or apps CloudKit container. So I guess this might be for the cache. This might be for the cache because it's my SD web image. One of its features is that it's maintaining a cache of images, so you don't need to refetch every time you need to reload the image, and so that might make sense. Nazi, you're saying, does the privacy requirement only apply to apps that make API calls? So no, the requirements, they apply to any apps. They apply to any apps, and then there are specific requirements for calling specific APIs, but all new apps are expected to provide this privacy manifest. And it's just one of the things that the privacy manifest collects is the use of these sensitive APIs. But if you're collecting user data, it might just be the name of your user. For instance, you need to report it in the privacy manifest. So it's not just API calls. I'm focusing on API calls because it's the one that Apple is enforcing the more strictly in the coming weeks. So it's the one that developers will need to focus on at first. So let's see where the timestamp is being used. So it's okay. So it's one of these things. So let's see. I'm not going to do trying to do a search in GitHub is not a great idea. I will download the project. Oh, that's a good point. So Octavian is saying, also bear in mind when using web views, as Apple specifies, you are responsible for JavaScript code as well when filling the privacy manifest. So yes, if you have JavaScript code that collects user information, indeed you are responsible for it. That makes sense. And I am sure that there is a lot of JavaScript code in advertisement frameworks that does a lot of weird things. I think we can be pretty sure pretty sure of that. So let's open it. So SD web image. Let's open the project. Okay. And so I wanted to search for calls to something called creation date. So we can see, yes, so it's getting the creation date key, and you can see it's for the cache configuration. To know when the cache when something has expired in the cache, you need to know when you have added it first. Like if an image has I don't know, like an expiration in the cache of like 1 hour, well, you need to know when you add it so that you can know that 1 hour has elapsed, and so you cannot get the data from the cache. You need to refetch it from the network. So that makes total sense, and it's a very valuable use case. Let me close all of these windows. And let me check. I think I've showed you everything I wanted to show you, actually. So don't leave yet, because last thing, I want to do a quick recap so that I can add the recap in the video, and also I can share it on social media as a short video that explains what's happening. So what do you need to know about the upcoming third-party SDK requirements? The gist of it is that Apple wants to make sure that app developers report accurate information about data that might be used to track or identify users. And one important part of it is making sure that all of the third-party SDKs included in iOS apps also report this information accurately, so that users are aware of what they are using. And so Apple is introducing these new privacy manifest files, which are going to gather data about what kind of data is used to track and identify users, which domains are used to track users, and which sensitive APIs are called, which might potentially be used to fingerprint devices, and for which we need to provide a good reason. And what's going to happen is that third-party SDKs and iOS apps will all need to provide this privacy manifest field accurately. And then when you submit your app to the App Store, Xcode will be able to take all of these privacy manifests, consolidate them into one single report that you will then be able to use in order to correctly set the privacy nutrition label on the App Store. So the nutrition label that informs the user on which information is being collected by an iOS app and for which purpose. What's interesting is that these requirements, they will apply to every app, but we saw that there are some subtleties. For instance, when you create a new app, you will need to provide a privacy manifest for the app, of course, but also for all of the SDKs it includes. But it seems that when you have an existing app, you will only need to provide a privacy manifest when you add a new SDK to that app. So if you have SDKs already used in production today, it doesn't seem that you need to update them in order to have a newer version that contains the privacy manifest, which is kind of a good news in a way, because we saw that there are some old frameworks, but still very popular frameworks that many apps use that simply haven't been updated to provide these privacy manifests. And one thing we saw is that in addition, so to the data being collected, there is also the sensitive APIs that could be used to collect data to fingerprint a device. And for these APIs, Apple is now enforcing that you state a valid reason for which you use the API. And Apple is enforcing this more strictly. And you need to provide a valid reason for each of these APIs that you are using by May 1st, 2024. So you've probably started to receive emails. If you haven't, the first time you submit an update for your app, you will start receiving them. So I guess what's recommended is to just send an update of your app just to see the email starting to arrive and to see which API you need to justify. And also by the length of the email, you will know if it's going to be a long job or not. But it's something that you will need to do in the coming weeks. And so it's good to be aware of it so that you can start and prepare for it and not discover this 1 week before and then have to rush trying to audit your code and trying to find the right reason for calling each of these sensitive APIs. So I think we're reaching the end of this live stream. So let me go back to full face cam. So I guess I just want to say, as always, thank you for watching. I hope this live stream was useful. It's the first time that I was doing a live stream to kind of like react or rather comment, try to explain something that's in the actuality for iOS developers, a requirement that is important now because it's going to be because Apple is going to start to enforce it soon. So it was very interesting to do, quite different from what I do usually, which is more about talking about code and trying to convey how a piece of code or an API or a technology should be used. But it was kind of nice. If I see other topics like this one in the future, I will definitely try to do more live streams like that. And I also got a great suggestion on trying to do a live stream about app transport transparency, Apple tracking transparency, or rather, I think ATT, it's app tracking transparency, and what it entails, which is more than just a pop-up to give consent. So thank you for this idea. I see a message in the chat. Hello from Kazakhstan. Well, thank you for joining. Unfortunately, we're close to the end, but don't worry. As always, there is a replay available straight as soon as the live stream is over. But thank you for joining from so far away. And I think, as always, I just need to say thank you for watching. Thank you for being here this evening. And see you next time for another video or another live stream. Bye bye.